Brooklyn didn't feel like a place built for softness in the early 1900s. Cold wind came in off the East River, rattling through the narrow blocks of tenement housing like a reminder that survival wasn't guaranteed. Men worked long hours, women carried the weight of entire households, and children grew up fast, sometimes too fast for their own good. Among those children was a thin, quiet boy named Louis Buchalter. Most people would never have guessed what he would become. He didn't shout. He didn't boast. He didn't look like trouble. If anything, he looked like a kid who'd slipped through a crowd unnoticed, like a shadow that never quite learned how to be dangerous. But Brooklyn had a way of forging people into something else. Louis was the youngest in a family that struggled from the moment they stepped off the boat from Eastern Europe. His father, a bread seller, did what he could. His mother tried to keep the house together. But poverty, like a slow-moving tide, kept rising around them. Then came the blow that changed everything. Louis's father died suddenly. Just like that, childhood became a luxury he couldn't afford. Louis drifted toward the streets not out of rebellion, but because the streets were the only place willing to open their doors. Kids like him discovered early how the world worked. You ate what you earned, and you kept what you could defend. Yet even then, something set Louis apart. He didn't try to be the toughest boy on the block. He wasn't the loudest. He wasn't the kind who threw a punch just to make noise. Instead, he watched. He learned. He listened. And he understood something important before he was old enough to shave. Power didn't always need volume. Sometimes it only needed silence and precision. It was that quiet calculation, almost invisible at first, that would eventually lead him to build one of the most feared enforcement armies in American crime history. But back then, he was just a boy walking the narrow Brooklyn streets with his hands in his pockets, eyes lowered, thoughts miles deep. The seeds of Murder Incorporated were still just seeds. Louis simply knew he wasn't going to let the world step on him again. Not ever. As Louis Buchalter moved from adolescence into adulthood, his personality hardened. Not loudly, not violently, but with a kind of cold focus. The illegal world of New York was expanding, and he slipped into it almost seamlessly. He began with small jobs, cut-rate thefts, petty hustles, the kind of street-level crime that didn't make headlines but paid the rent. Louis didn't rush. He didn't swing for the fences. Instead, he paid attention to who controlled what, who owed who, and where the money actually flowed. You could say Louis had a gift, one that didn't come wrapped in muscles or menace. He had a talent for organization. While other young men bragged about their schemes, Louis mapped out systems. While others spent their money on nightlife, Louis reinvested every dollar. While others took unnecessary risks, he played the numbers, observed patterns, and made decisions with a soft but reliable ruthlessness. And New York took notice. The garment industry became his doorway to real power. Factories needed muscle. Truckers needed protection. Union representatives needed guidance. And employers, terrified of strikes, were willing to pay for stability, even if that stability came wrapped in an extortion envelope. Louis stepped into that world with the same quiet stride he'd used since childhood. He didn't bully. He negotiated. Then he enforced those negotiations with absolute finality. Soon enough, he wasn't Louis anymore. He was Lepke, a nickname that, in Yiddish, suggested something small, something sweet, something harmless. It was the greatest irony of his career. Everything about him seemed understated. His voice, his appearance, his demeanor. He didn't look like a gangster. He didn't sound like a gangster. But beneath that calm exterior lay a cold logic that would define an era. It was that quiet efficiency that drew the attention of the underworld's biggest names. Jacob Gura Shapiro, Tommy Lucchese, Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky. They saw in Lepke something rare. A man who could organize crime with the discipline of a corporate executive and the steel nerves of a battlefield commander. And so a partnership was born. What began with controlling unions and racketeering soon grew into something far darker. A centralized enforcement squad capable of delivering violence with precision, secrecy, and chilling professionalism. The press would eventually name it Murder Inc. And at its top, standing in the shadows, was Lepke Buchalter, the quiet boss who never raised his voice, yet commanded death with a nod. The 1930s became Lepke's decade. New York's underworld had never seen anything like the machine he built. Murder Incorporated was not a typical street gang, not a group of hot-headed thugs waiting for orders. It was a disciplined network of contract killers, watchers, informants, and loyal enforcers who carried out mob decisions with cold precision. They didn't work for one family, they worked for all of them. Lepke turned murder into a service industry, and he managed it like any efficient business. Hits were assigned with no emotional involvement. Payments were standardized. Evidence disposal was systematic. Killers were chosen for specific strengths. No freelance violence was allowed. Violence in Lepke's world wasn't chaos. It was an instrument, and he wielded it quietly. He rarely attended the murders he ordered. He rarely argued or shouted. He simply decided, and others carried it out. But in the shadows of success, paranoia began creeping into Lepke's mind. Federal pressure was increasing. The FBI had grown more ambitious. Politicians were cracking down on corruption. And gangsters he knew for years began whispering, wondering who would cooperate, who might fall to pressure, who could flip to save themselves. For a man who'd lived his entire life under control, the idea of losing it felt like a blade against the back of his neck. And that fear became a slow, corrosive poison. One by one, associates felt the cold shift. Lepke became more distant, more secretive. He cut ties. He demanded silence. And in moments of panic, he ordered deaths that were meant to clean house. But every purge created more fear. Every fear created more whispers. And every whisper in the underworld eventually found its way to law enforcement. Meanwhile, a man named Abe Relis, a murderer, an insider of Murder Incorporated, and a man with a survival instinct stronger than loyalty, had begun to feel the walls closing in. His testimony would be the match. Lepke's paranoia would be the gasoline. And the empire he built with such methodical patience would soon begin to burn. Lepke did something no major crime boss had ever done before. He went into hiding. Not for weeks, not for months, but for years. The quiet boss became the invisible boss, disappearing into a network of safe houses and isolated apartments arranged by loyal associates who feared both law enforcement and his potential wrath. While he hid, the world kept moving without him. The Mafia reorganized. Business shifted hands. Power brokers formed new alliances. And Lepke, once the sharpest mind in organized crime, watched from hiding as his influence began slipping away like sand through fingers. The pressure broke him in ways no rival ever could. His decisions grew erratic. His communication sparse. His temper unpredictable. This wasn't the quiet calculation of the boy from Brooklyn. This was a man suffocating under the weight of his own empire. Eventually, something unprecedented happened. Lepke surrendered. He walked into federal custody not as a kingpin, not as the mastermind of Murder Incorporated, but as a man exhausted by his own paranoia. For the underworld, it was unthinkable. For law enforcement, it was a triumph. For Lepke, it was the beginning of the end. One conviction turned into two. Two turned into a recommendation. The recommendation turned into a sentence. No mob boss had ever received in American history. The death penalty. Abe Relis had talked at length. Witnesses came forward. Evidence mounted. And Lepke Buchalter, once the quiet architect of organized crime's deadliest enforcement arm, walked toward a fate he could no longer negotiate. On a cold night in 1944, inside Sing Sing prison, the final chapter of Lepke Buchalter's story played out with the same calmness he'd shown his entire life. There were no wild speeches, no defiance, no last-minute attempts at glory. He simply accepted what was coming, walking steadily toward the electric chair, dressed neatly, composed, silent to the very end. Witnesses said he looked like a businessman on his way to a late appointment. In a way, he was, when the switch was thrown and the current surged, an era ended. Lepke's empire dissolved. Murder Incorporated collapsed. The quiet boss who built a machine of violence through discipline and silence left behind a legacy that would haunt the American underworld for decades. His story is not the story of loud gunshots or dramatic betrayals played out in alleyways. It is the story of a man who understood that power, when wielded softly, could be more terrifying than any scream. And in the calm, dark corners of Mafia history, his shadow still lingers, quiet, calculating, and unforgettable.